Hello everyone. Today we are going to be going through different types of loops in Java and when you would want to use each one. And we're going to go through some practice questions to make sure you guys really understand. So the first thing we're going to start with is probably the most common type of loops used. And these are called for loops. So let's just go through the syntax first. A for loop typically looks like this. You have a variable, a condition, and then operation to be done after this code is run. Now, the important thing to remember is whatever statements you want executed per iteration has to be in these curly brackets. It's one of the most annoying things about coding is you forget a curly bracket, you forget a semicolon, and then nothing works. So be on top of that and make sure you have those things. So how this works, let's just put something that runs hello. How this works is, so the variable I is initialized to 0. So before this loop runs, or I guess the first iteration, I is 0. Then the next thing that happens is the for loop checks if this condition is true. Is I less than 10? In this case it is. And then this happens after the statements in the curly brackets are run. Let's say if it started at 1, people would think that, oh, it goes from 1 to 10. No, it goes from 1 to 9 because it has to be less than 10. So let's just see to make sure I'm not making things up. And you can see hello is written 9 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. However, if this was 0, it'd run 10 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's a very important thing to look out for, is the condition. Let's try if this was less than or equal to 10. Now, before I run it, have like an estimate in your head as to how many times this will run. Now that you have your guess, let's check. This is actually going to run 11 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Now, if you're confused, let me explain. Since I is initialized to 0, the condition is now whether I is less than or equal to 10. And now I is equal to 10 for the last iteration. And this condition will check, is I, which is now 10, less than or equal to 10? And it is. So it'll run one more time, and then I will be incremented to 11, and then this condition will be checked, is I less than or equal to 10? And it won't be, so then this will not run. So it ran 11 times in this scenario. Now, let's say I was initialized to be 1. How many times do you think this statement, hello, will be executed? Now that you have your guess, let's check. This time, it should be run only 10 times, and let's confirm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And if you're confused, the explanation for that is, since I started at 1, it'll keep going, running the statement, incrementing afterwards, and then let's say it gets to 10. At this point, it has run 9 times. It ran when I was 1, then when I was 2, 3, 4, 5, so on, so on, so on. Then once it gets to 10, this condition will again be checked, is I, which is now 10, less than or equal to 10? It is? Perfect. This statement will be executed, will be incremented to 11, and then this condition will be checked. Is 11 less than or equal to 10? No. So then the statement, this for loop, is done. And then it was printed 10 times in total. So this is just the basics, like intro into loops. So I won't go through many more complicated, but just be aware that it does get a lot more complicated than just this. This is kind of just the basics of it. But once you have this down and you have like the actual understanding, like the complex stuff will really not be that challenging. When to use these for loops, if you're thinking, if you have a question given from an exam, let's say, and it doesn't tell you what type of loop to use, it just says using loops, answer this question, you are going to want to use a for loop when it has to be run a specific amount of times. Like you know that there's a certain amount of iterations that you want done. So if you know, like, I want this to be run 10 times, 11 times, 20 times, 100 times, regardless, this is when you're going to want to use for loops. Now, while loop, typically, okay, we have to initialize a variable first, because in while loops do not have the same syntax as for loops. So let's say I is equal to 0, and then the syntax, while I is less than 10. Just to make it similar to the for loop examples we used, this is how it would look. And again, the statements that you want to be run, like you want the statements to be executed while this loop is running, again, has to be in curly brackets. So you have your variable integer I is equal to 0. And this, let's say, same thing again, just to make it less complicated. This statement will continuously be executed as long as this condition is met. So if I is 0, and this will happen while I is less than 10, we have to have something that changes to I. Otherwise, this will cause an infinite loop, because I never changes. I will always be 0, and I will always be less than 10. This will cause a stack overflow, which causes an error, because this while loop is never terminated. It just keeps going and going and going and going. So we can put I++ dot after this statement is executed, I is incremented by 1. So place a guess in your head as to how many times you think this statement will be run. To make it easier, actually, let me put what I is, so we don't have to count every single time. So now that you have your guess, let's run it. There we go. Okay, I'll put a space. It's run 10 times in total, but it starts from 0. It goes from 0 to 9, which is 10 iterations in total. But if we were to put I is equal to 1, then it would be a similar output as the for loops, and it will only run 9 times. But if we do the same thing with the for loops and change the condition to I is less than or equal to 10, then this will run 10 times. But if we change I to be equal to 0, it'll run 11 times. It goes from 0 to 10, 11 times, because start from 0, goes all the way until I is equal to 10, and then it stops when I is greater than 10. Now the thing with while loops, knowing when to use them, you're going to want to use them when you don't necessarily know how many times you want it to run. Like this would be more efficient using for loops. It just makes more sense because you know how many iterations you need. The thing with while loops, it keeps running until a condition is met. And that condition doesn't necessarily depend on the amount of iterations that you need to do. So let's say we had a Boolean. Boolean done, and this is false. And we can still have our integer I is equal to 0, but we have a Boolean. Now we're going to change the condition to while it is not done. So while this condition is false, which it is here right now, so while done stays false, this loop, these statements will keep being executed. But obviously, as I said before, this will cause a stack overflow because there's nowhere in this code where done is ever going to be true. So let's say then if statement, if I is equal to 10, then done is true. So what's going to happen in this code is we have our Boolean, which is false, so not done. We have our integer. So this loop, this whole thing will keep going until done is true. And done will only be true when I is equal to 10. So obviously we need to increment I, but we'll do that at the very end of the loop. Because I remember I really struggled with loops when I was first learning them for some reason. Now I'm looking back and I'm like, oh, this is really, really, really not confusing at all. Let me just go through this code step by step and make sure you guys really understand what's even happening here, because that was one of the problems I had when I was watching YouTube tutorials, is that they were coding as if like I knew how to code. And I'm like, I'm watching this video for a reason. I don't know what I'm doing. And like, none of this is making sense. So Boolean, just a variable, is false. We have our integer I, which is equal to 0. This whole thing will run until that exclamation means not. So this will run as long as not done. So as long as done is false. Then once done is true, this condition is not going to be met anymore. So what's going to happen is, for every time, every iteration that this loop is run, it's going to print out what I is, and then hello, similar to what we have right here. So it's going to print out. And then in the loop, there's an if statement, which is asking if I is equal to 10, then change the variable done to be true instead of false. But while I is not 10, this whole thing is going to be skipped. And then I is just going to be incremented by 1. Let's see what happens. There we go. It's literally the same thing. And it worked how we expected it, because the first iteration printed I and hello. Then this was not true, so done is still false. Then it's incremented, incremented, incremented. Then once I reaches 10, this statement is checked, and it's like, oh, is I equal to 10? Yes. Okay. Now the variable done is going to be true. I is incremented one more time, which doesn't really matter, to be honest, because it's not like that's the condition that's being checked. But since now done is true, this while loop, when it gets to this point, it's going to be like, oh, while not done, well, it is done. Done is true now, so we're not running this whole loop anymore. Next, we're going to go through do while loops. And these are literally, while loops and do while loops are quite literally the same thing, except for the fact that the do while loop will always run at least once. A do while loop will always run at least once. And now let me give you 2 examples of the same question, but one using a while loop and one using a do while loop, just so you can really see what the difference is. So let's go through while loops first, since you guys already know. Okay, so basically, let me just give you a breakdown of what's actually happening here. So we have a scanner. The system is going to ask you to enter a number, which you're going to enter on your keyboard. Click enter, and then that value you put in is going to be the value of num. And then as long as you do not enter 10, it'll keep asking you over and over again to enter a number. And then when you do put in the number 10, this whole thing is going to stop. And once it stops, it's going to print out done on the screen. So let's take a look at the console. It's asking me to enter a number. So I'll enter in 2. And since I didn't put in 10, and this condition is not met, this whole thing will keep running over and over again. So again, let's say I put in 5, 7, and then this time I'm going to put in 10, and it's not going to run anymore, and it's going to print done. There we go. And then, okay, let's try an example where I put in 10 right away. This whole while loop never even run, because num equals 10 from the very beginning, so it skipped this whole loop and just printed done. Now, let's use the same example for a do while loop. So we still have everything's the same. The syntax is just slightly different, where you have do the loop statements in the curly brackets, and then the condition is checked at the very end. And then if this condition is still true, then this whole loop runs again. Like I said at the beginning, the difference is that with the do while loop, the loop statement will always be run at least one time. Whereas in a while loop, as you saw in the previous example, there are times where the while loop is never run because the condition was never met to begin with. So it's asking me to enter a number. Say I put in 2, it'll ask me again. Put in 5, it'll ask me again. Put in 5 again, it'll ask me again until I put in 10. Then it'll be done. However, in the last example with the while loops, when I entered 10 the very first time, it didn't ask me to enter a number again. However, this time it will ask me again because enter a number, I put in 10. There's no condition. Java has no idea what condition has to be met yet. So they're like, okay, regardless of whatever num is, I have to run this regardless. So then when I put in 10 one more time, it'll stop. But if I were to put in 10 and then I put in 5, it's going to keep going until it gets 10 again. And that's the main difference. A do while will always be run at least one time, whereas a while loop doesn't necessarily have to be run at all. Now we are going to go into for each loops. Now for each loops are really only useful when you have a collection of items. Like if you have an array, or if you have an array list, or a linked list, or just any type of list, or any sort of collection. So let's create an array of integers. So let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, that's our array of integers. And now this is the syntax of a for each loop. We're going to create a new variable. We're going to name it number. And then you're going to have a colon and then nums, the name of your collection. In this case, the array is called nums, so that's what we're using. And again, with every type of loop, the statements need to be in curly brackets. So, and let's just say, let's make it really simple. And let's say we just wanted to print out the number. So basically what's happening here is you're taking your array and you're going through each individual element. So at some point, the variable number is going to be equal to 1. And then it's going to be equal to 2. Then it's going to be equal to 3, and so on and so on and so on until it gets to 8 and until it gets to the end of the collection. So running this, what we should be seeing is literally just these printed out again. And that's exactly what we see. Okay, that pretty much concludes our video on intro to loops in Java. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I hope you guys like my style of teaching.